Something happened in late February 2026 that most people have already forgotten about. 53 oil refineries caught fire. Not one, not three, 53. Across 6 continents in 45 days, Russia, India, Australia, Mexico, Ecuador, the United States. Officially, accidents, technical failures, flange joint leaks, equipment malfunctions, all of them, simultaneously, across the entire planet. Here's another thing that happened this year that nobody talks about at dinner. The United States published a military strategy document. Publicly, anyone can download it, in which the American government officially abandoned the phrase rules-based international order. They just stopped using it. After 70 years, gone, replaced with 5 words: Americans and their concrete interests. And then there's this. Right now, as you watch this video, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow corridor through which 20% of the world's oil travels every single day, is effectively blockaded. The United States and Iran are at war, and the global energy system is running on fumes and prayers. 3 facts, 3 fires, 1 picture. I'm not going to tell you it's a conspiracy. I'm going to do something more unsettling than that. I'm going to show you that it might be a plan, and that the plan was written down, published, made available to anyone willing to read it. Almost nobody read it. This is game theory number 21. Let's go. Picture the global economy as a human body. Oil is the blood, cargo ships are the veins, and scattered across the world's oceans, there are maybe a dozen points so geographically narrow, so structurally critical, that if you squeeze them, then the whole body suffocates. These are called choke points. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply passes through it. 1/5. Every refinery, every power plant, every petrol station in half of Europe and all of Asia depends in some proportion on oil that squeezes through that gap. The Strait of Malacca, between Malaysia and Indonesia, 80% of China's imported oil transits through this passage every single day. The Panama Canal, the shortcut between the Atlantic and the Pacific, the one that the Trump administration is now openly and in writing declaring must remain under American control. The Strait of Gibraltar, 9 miles wide, the only maritime exit from the Mediterranean Sea. Every tanker moving goods between southern Europe and the rest of the world passes through those 9 miles. These are not just geography, they are leverage. And the United States, almost uniquely in the world, has the naval capability, the alliance network, and the forward deployed military assets to meaningfully influence all of them simultaneously. Here's the cold logic of what this means. If you control the choke points, you control who gets resources and who doesn't. You can quietly restrict the flow to a country that is growing too powerful. You can open it up for a country that needs propping up. You don't need to invade anyone. You don't need to issue formal sanctions. You don't even need to make a phone call. You just adjust the valve. It's not domination, it's maintenance. Like a building superintendent who controls the water supply to every apartment in the tower. The tenants don't know he has the valve. They just know somehow that when they get difficult, the pressure drops. And here's what makes this more than abstract theory. This logic, almost word for word, is embedded in America's official 2026 National Defense Strategy, a document that was published in January, that anyone can download, that almost nobody has read. Let's fix that. Every few years, the U.S. Department of Defense publishes something called a National Defense Strategy. It lays out, in relatively plain language, the military priorities of the United States government. It names adversaries. It describes objectives. It announces to anyone paying attention how American power intends to be used. Most people don't pay attention. The 2026 version dropped in January, and if you read the previous versions alongside it, you feel the floor shift. For decades, going back to the end of World War II, American defense strategies were framed in the language of universal values, upholding the international rules-based order, multilateral cooperation, democratic principles. The United States positioned itself as the reluctant global sheriff, not out of self-interest, but out of a higher responsibility. You could argue about whether that was ever true, but that was the story. The 2026 strategy opens by saying the United States will put Americans and their concrete interests first. No rules-based order, no multilateral anything, just interests, concrete ones. The document then describes the military as a warrior ethos organization, not a peacekeeping force, not a democracy exporter, but a machine designed to win wars. It calls for rebuilding America as the arsenal of democracy. That phrase, borrowed directly from Franklin Roosevelt in 1940, carries enormous weight. Roosevelt used it when the United States was preparing to arm the entire Allied world against fascism. The choice to revive it in 2026 is not accidental. But here's where the document becomes genuinely arresting. It explicitly carves out the entire Western Hemisphere as America's non-negotiable zone of influence. It pledges to actively and fearlessly defend America's interests throughout the Western Hemisphere. It singles out the Panama Canal by name, and then, in a sentence that would have seemed bizarre 3 years ago, it mentions Greenland. Greenland, an autonomous Arctic island, strategically positioned above the North Atlantic, controlling naval access between Europe and North America. The Trump administration has openly discussed acquiring it. The NDS signals it is now considered within the American sphere. Read these together. Hormuz, Malacca, Panama, Gibraltar, Greenland. Draw lines on a map. What you get is not a defense posture, it's a perimeter around the entire global energy and trade system, with the United States as the gatekeeper who decides who passes and who waits. Now, why Iran and why now? Here's a question that gets asked surprisingly rarely. What does the United States actually gain if it defeats Iran militarily? A country with no deep-water navy, no nuclear weapons, at least not deployed ones, a GDP roughly the size of a mid-sized American state, no direct capability to threaten the American homeland. As a military prize, Iran is not exactly a grand conquest. So why are we here? The answer crystallizes when you stop looking at Iran and start looking at what Iran sits next to. The Strait of Hormuz. The countries most vulnerable to a Hormuz disruption are not the United States. America now produces more oil than it consumes. It is a net exporter. Disruptions to Hormuz are, in a narrow sense, good for American oil revenues. The countries most vulnerable to Hormuz disruption are China, India, Japan, South Korea, and most of continental Europe. America's rivals, America's customers, America's leverage. And this is the uncomfortable arithmetic at the center of this conflict. A prolonged war in Iran, even a messy, inconclusive, grinding one, keeps that choke point unstable. It keeps the threat of disruption permanently live. It keeps the nations most dependent on Persian Gulf oil in a perpetual state of anxiety. Dependent, negotiable, careful about how loudly they complain about American behavior elsewhere. You do not need to win the war to extract value from it. You just need it to continue. That logic sounds too cynical to be believed, except it maps precisely onto what is actually happening. The Hormuz blockade has been active for weeks. Global oil prices are elevated. Asian manufacturers are absorbing an energy premium. Chinese refineries are scrambling for alternative supply routes. And the United States is pumping more oil than at any point in its history, selling it to nervous buyers at a comfortable markup. The war is not costing America oil security. The war is America's oil business. Now let's pull the camera back further, because Iran is one move. The China strategy is the entire game. Over the past decade, quietly and methodically, the United States has been tightening a ring of alliances and agreements around China's coastline. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, India, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. Some of these are formal treaties going back to the Cold War. Some are newer. All of them are positioned along what military strategists call the First Island Chain, a curved arc of land stretching from the Japanese archipelago down through Southeast Asia to the tip of the Malay Peninsula. This chain creates a geographic cage. And inside that cage, one passage matters above all others: the Strait of Malacca. China needs oil. China needs enormous quantities of oil, and roughly 80% of its oil imports pass through Malacca, a passage whose access points are flanked by American allies. Now, the United States does not need to physically blockade Malacca. It doesn't need to park an aircraft carrier in the strait. It simply needs China to know, with absolute certainty, that in a serious crisis, it could. That awareness, that ever-present knowledge that the economic lifeline can be cut, is the actual deterrent, not destruction, not invasion. Economic strangulation is a permanent background condition. And the strategy is not even secretly hostile to China. The United States doesn't want to destroy China. A destroyed China would take half the global economy down with it, including significant portions of the American economy. What the United States wants is for China to remain integrated, dependent on American-managed trade routes, reliant on the dollar system, powerful enough to be a productive economic partner, but never quite powerful enough to say no. You keep your rivals strong enough to be useful, not strong enough to be free. It is, in its own glacially cold way, sophisticated. The numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. Roughly $1.5 trillion has already been allocated to new weapons and defense procurement in the current political cycle. Not the annual budget, procurement, hardware, missiles, destroyers, hypersonic systems, the physical infrastructure of sustained global military presence. The 2026 strategy explicitly calls for America to become the arms supplier for the entire Western-aligned world, the arsenal of democracy. And right now, the customers are lining up. Eastern European nations threatened by Russia, they buy American. Southeast Asian countries nervously watching the South China Sea, they buy American. Gulf states navigating the Iran conflict, they buy American. The threat environment, real or managed, is the product. And the United States, almost uniquely, can supply it. This is not a side effect of the strategy. It is a feature. Because what you end up with is a global security economy in which America is simultaneously the insurer, the arms dealer, the energy exporter, and the financial system through which all of these transactions occur, in dollars settled through American-controlled banking infrastructure. There is a word for an entity that holds all of those roles simultaneously. It is not a particularly comfortable word, but it is the accurate one. $500 billion, $500 billion. That is the announced investment in what has been called Operation Stargate, a program to construct artificial intelligence data centers across the United States at a scale that has never been attempted. The initiative is anchored by OpenAI and Oracle and backed by a combination of private capital and government interest that makes the boundary between the two somewhat academic. Officially, artificial intelligence research, keeping America at the technological frontier, strategic competition with China in the domain where the next century will be decided. That is probably true, partly. But infrastructure is dual use, always. The same data center that trains an AI model can process surveillance data at a national scale. The same computing power that runs a language model can cross-reference financial transactions, movement histories, and digital communications across an entire population in real time at marginal cost. The United States already operates the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in human history. What Stargate builds is the civilian infrastructure beneath it. Digital ID systems are being discussed in legislatures across the Western world. Central bank digital currencies, where every transaction is recorded, attributable, and potentially reversible, are being piloted in various jurisdictions. These are real policy conversations, not fringe speculation. And the question isn't whether these tools will be abused. The question is simpler and more historical. What does a government operating under sustained wartime conditions, with wartime budgets, wartime language, wartime psychology, tend to do with tools that allow it to monitor and manage its own population? History answers that question pretty consistently, and the answer is always the same. Now we arrive at the strangest piece of this architecture, the one that sounds most theatrical, the one your instinct is to dismiss. Don't. In the 1930s, a movement called Technocracy Incorporated put forward a radical proposal. They argued that all of North America, Canada, the United States, Mexico, and parts of Central America should be unified into a single continent-sized state, not governed by politicians or market forces, governed by engineers and technical experts, using energy accounting as the basis of the economy. A self-sufficient, scientifically administered empire with no need for foreign resources, foreign financing, or foreign permission. They called it the technate of America. The movement faded. But pay attention to what did not fade. What is the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, if not an economic integration framework that binds 3 sovereign nations into a single regulated market? What is American pressure on Mexico, on immigration, on energy, on security, if not the management of a neighboring state rather than a relationship with an equal? What is the open, seriously floated discussion of incorporating Canada raised at the highest political levels, if not the technate logic returning in modern dress? Greater North America? That phrase keeps appearing in the strategic thinking around the Trump administration. A resource base, a food base, a manufacturing base, a hemisphere so rich in oil, gas, farmland, fresh water, and rare earth minerals that it need never depend on any foreign power for anything essential. A continent-sized fortress. Now add to that fortress control of the global sea lanes, dominance in weapons manufacturing, the world's reserve currency, an AI-powered domestic infrastructure, a military strategy that declares the hemisphere inviolable. At some point, you stop calling it a country. Back to the refineries. 53 fires, 45 days. I promised at the start that I'm not going to tell you it was a coordinated sabotage campaign. And I won't, because the most credible explanation is mundane. The Hormuz blockade cut global oil supply. Refineries around the world scrambled to compensate, running at higher capacity, deferring maintenance, pushing aging equipment past safe operating limits. Under maximum sustained stress, infrastructure that was already old and already fragile started failing. This is not a conspiracy. This is engineering. You push a system too hard. It breaks where it was already weak. But here is what the fires reveal, even if every single one of them was an accident. The global energy system is far more fragile than the people running it want you to know. It operates on thin margins, minimal redundancy. Supply chains that were engineered for a world at peace and have never been tested against sustained disruption at scale. When one choke point destabilizes, just one, the stress propagates through the entire system almost immediately. Refineries on 5 continents feel it within weeks. And here is the strategic implication of that fragility. You do not need to sabotage the system to profit from its instability. You do not need to light the fires yourself. You just need to be the one with the stable supply, the one with the fire extinguisher, the one that nervous buyers call when the pressure drops. The United States, in this conflict, is that entity. It didn't cause every fire, it just made sure it would be positioned to sell the water. Now we arrive at the part of the story that the strategists do not put in their published documents. History has a consistent verdict on this kind of architecture. It works, for a while. The Roman Empire controlled Mediterranean choke points for centuries. The British Empire managed global sea lanes for over 100 years. The American post-war order has lasted 80 years on the foundation of dollar dominance and naval supremacy. All of them eventually cracked, not because they were defeated by a single stronger rival, because the strategy itself generates the conditions of its own failure. Choke point control requires maintaining presence everywhere, simultaneously, indefinitely. It requires allies who remain willing, clients who remain loyal, domestic populations willing to bear, and taxes and sons and daughters and civil liberties surrendered, the cost of permanent global military engagement. Each of those requirements is a slow leak. Japan, asked to confront China on America's behalf, will eventually ask what exactly is in this arrangement for Japan. European nations, watching every multilateral agreement renegotiated in favor of American interests, will begin quietly diversifying. Latin American governments, managed as a resource pool rather than engaged as partners, will accumulate grievances that eventually become political upheaval. And inside the United States itself, funding a $1.5 trillion military economy, while wages stagnate and public services erode, the politics get ugly in ways that are difficult to control. Military spending at this scale breeds corruption. It breeds entire industries whose business model depends on conflict never ending. It breeds a political class that is increasingly responsive to defense contractors and decreasingly responsive to the people nominally electing them. The professor whose analysis animated this video ends with a prediction. He says, the United States will not be defeated in Iran, but it will not win either. The actual objective, managing the Hormuz choke point, cannot be sustained indefinitely against a world that increasingly resents paying the toll. He predicts that the majority of the globe gradually aligns against American primacy, not in a single dramatic military confrontation, in a slow coalition of exhaustion, countries that have simply had enough of the management fees. And when that tipping point arrives, the American empire does not collapse dramatically. It retreats, back into its hemisphere, back behind its walls, the technate finally complete, not through conquest of the world, but through abandonment of it. Fortress America, self-sufficient, isolated, and, in its own way, diminished. I want to leave you with something I genuinely cannot resolve. Everything described in this video is, from one angle, rational. Controlling choke points is rational. Building a self-sufficient continental base is rational. Maintaining technological supremacy is rational. Even using a regional war as a mechanism to keep rivals dependent and nervous, if you can stomach the moral weight of it, is rational in the cold language of grand strategy. Rational strategies, executed to their logical conclusions, have a tendency to produce outcomes that are profoundly irrational. Versailles was rational. It produced the 1930s. The British strategy of managed decline was rational. It produced Suez. The American strategy of containment was rational. It produced Vietnam. What happens when a strategy this large, this explicitly imperial in its ambitions, this dependent on everything going according to plan, collides with the part of history that never does? Nobody knows, including the people designing it. What we do know is this. They wrote it down, they published it, the defense strategy, the hemisphere doctrine, the arsenal of democracy language, the Greenland calculus, the arsenal budgets, all of it in documents that are publicly available to anyone who goes looking. They just didn't translate it into the language people scroll past on their phones. And so most people went back to whatever they were doing. While the board was being set, 53 refineries burned, the Strait of Hormuz stayed closed. The documents stayed on the government's website. And somewhere, the game continued. This is game theory number 21. The question is not whether you understand the game. The question is whether understanding it changes anything. I'll let you sit with that.